There is a lot of confusion about foreign policy, the role it plays in international relations, the relationship it has with the domestic policy of a nation, who makes it, and how is it related to allied discipline of diplomacy. Most people believe that foreign policy is something which is dealing with other nations outside your own borders. What is the cause that you have to have a foreign policy? Why do you want the international environment to be favorable to you? Ultimately, it is to protect your national interest. And I think the national interests are indivisible. There is no dividing line between a national interest of a country which is domestic and one which is international. Ultimately, all foreign policy is a projection of domestic policies. We want to be left alone. We want to protect the unity, integrity, and sovereignty of our state. And we want to be free to follow the path of economic progress, social organization, or the political system which we are happiest with. We don't want any external interference. So we wish to have a foreign policy that allows us to pursue our domestic policies without anybody else's coercion or interference. But then, what does diplomacy do? Mostly what we see on the international stage is hectic diplomatic activity. One great leader has a summit meeting with another great leader. It could be Nehru with Eisenhower, it could be Mr. Modi with Obama or Trump or Xi or Abe. And you say, oh, you keep analyzing body language and you see the chemistry which is synchronizing. And we think that the friendship between charismatic leaders can lead to lasting friendship between nations. Obviously, this is not true. Diplomacy is the part which is the implementation of a foreign policy. The formulation of foreign policy is done separately, and it is done maybe by different people, by a variety of reasons. What are the resources at the command of a nation? What are the domestic compulsions? Have the domestic policies of a nation state changed in line, in tune with the changing international context? Or are they out of step? Are they ahead of it? Are they in consonance? Are they in dissonance? So all these things are important. So we have to worry about two things when we talk of foreign policy: the formulation of foreign policy and implementation of foreign policy. And in both cases, what is important is to talk of a key concept of national interest. This is really confusing. Who defines national interest? What are national interests? The leadership, obviously, in a democracy, elected representative of the people. In a dictatorship, whoever is wielding ultimate power decides what the national interests are. But are the national interests ultimately the interests of a people, of a nation state? Do they do it good, or do they only serve the small elite leadership? This debate goes on. We shall discuss this at greater length elsewhere. But at the moment, what is important is to realize that there is a primary national interest of each nation state. That is to protect its independence, its integrity, and its sovereignty. It is possible that you have the appearance of having protected your borders, your integrity is intact geographically, your independence may be intact visibly because you may have regular elections, but the reality might be that your independence is an empty shell. The sovereignty might have been mortgaged to another larger, more powerful nation, or even in the 21st century, it had started happening in 20th century, into a multinational corporation. If you have a look at the number of member states of the United Nations, 193 plus minus, and you have more nations which are not members of United Nations, you have about 200. And of these 200, exclude the 10 top states, nation states in size, population, economic resources, and you have many more multinational corporations which command resources and political power more than many nation states. So the ruling elites of these powerless nation states are more or less dependent on a more powerful political patron, a larger power, or a multinational corporation. So that is the crucial issue, the sovereignty. And it is not only a small nation state somewhere in the Pacific Islands, microscopic, micro-state, which suffers from this hazard. You have large states. You have a state like Canada, great geographical expanse, but situated in the North American continent. It cannot be imagined that Canada, despite being an independent nation, a sovereign nation, rich in economic resources, great in size, can afford to take a foreign policy initiative which is not liked by the United States of America. Its position is not very different from Mexico in Central America or Argentina in Latin America or Brazil. Large countries, regional powers almost, but isolated by Pacific and Atlantic and living under the shadow of a really powerful, what has been described as a hyperpower or a superpower, and you have the problem. You have the problem of limited sovereignty. Now the problem is that it was the same in the Soviet Union era. Brezhnev enunciated the doctrine of limited sovereignty of partners of Soviet Union, which were in effect satellite states, which were in effect thinly disguised colonies. Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, there were military interventions by Soviet Union during the Stalinist era. After that, military interventions were not necessary. They accepted the domination of Soviet Union to an extent where they acceded to this theory of limited sovereignty. You have cases like Japan after the Second World War, forced to accept that it will not maintain an army, it would accept American bases, it would accept American protection, it would be allowed to prosper economically to an extent, but when the Americans realized that the Japanese were emerging as an economic superpower, immediate steps were taken, some say deliberately, to make Japan aware of its dependence on imported energy, high costs of labor and exports, and other tigers gave tough competition to Japan like South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan was carved in on all sides. This was before the times China accepted modern economic liberalization and modernization, had special economic zones, offered cheaper labor, offered larger markets, had more skilled, affordable manpower, and Japan was put in its proper place. So you have this problem. You also have the problem of limited sovereignty of a different kind. You have a country rich in oil resources like Saudi Arabia, and you have the state incapable of exploring oil, exploiting oil, refining oil, and depending on what are called the Seven Sisters, the American majors in oil industry, Stanback, Mobil, Exxon, etc. And ultimately, whether it is a fire in the oil wells, whether it is technology to extract the best quality oil, transported in tankers, you are dependent on somebody else. So you are rich, you are very rich, you are fabulously rich, you can afford to live the way you live, but ultimately you do not control your most valuable, priceless economic resource, and somebody else does that for you. So you have this situation where you have to worry about concept of limited sovereignty, and the idea is that not every nation state in the world can afford to claim to be sovereign. Some, as George Orwell said in his Animal Farm, some animals are more equal than other animals, but let's not stretch the analogy too far. But the point is that there probably are 8 or 9 countries in the world which can have the ambition of being truly independent and free in their foreign policy choices. Now, what decides that? That takes us to a very, very interesting question. What are the domestic sources of power and credible foreign policy and independent foreign policy? The first one is the most traditional one, historically, size. If the country, nation state occupies an area on the map which is large enough, nobody can neglect it. And its sovereignty is more or less protected by the size itself. Take, for instance, the case of Russia, later Soviet Union, back again to Russia, and you take 2 great invasions. Napoleon's invasion of Russia, and Russians followed a policy for scorched earth. They kept withdrawing, binding their own cities, and drawing in Napoleon and his armies, who perished in the frost and defeated by General Frost. You have more than 120 years after that, another invasion of Russia by the Nazi armies sent by the Führer, the Hitler. Same policy followed. Russians kept withdrawing. The German armies overstretched themselves and ultimately ended up defeated by the sheer expanse of the Russians. The Russians paid a very heavy price for the scorched earth policy. But the fact remains that the size of Russia, 1/5, 1/6 of the globe at different times, allows it the luxury of security and independence which nobody else can claim as easily. United States can, of course, the same comparable size advantage, power advantage. Besides the size, the second thing which is important is location and the form. So they say size, shape, location in geopolitics. Where is it located? Russia is the Eurasian heartland. It is a massive landmass stretching from Pacific to European border, to Urals. So the point is from almost Arctic zone to Central Asia. So you have different cultural influences, you have a variety of natural resources, you have a large enough concentration of population in urban centers where the climate is right, and you have space to play around with. But the point is, you also are touching so many other countries. You are bordering almost China in Siberia. You are bordering Canada in Alaska side. It was given away to America by Russians at one stage. You are bordering Central Asia, Iran, Afghanistan, and erstwhile Central Asian republics. And you are almost touching Iran and Afghanistan and so on. So you can't do that. Then there are other countries smaller in size but occupying a location which is important for others strategically. You might be a small island like Mauritius in Indian Ocean, Diego Garcia. You might be a small tip in the southern Africa, which had an important strategic role in pre-Suez Canal days, pre-development of airline traffic, but you still are important because somebody wants to have a satellite station there to keep an eye on the world rest over. You want some port where the submarine can surface, refuel, replenish their resources and go ahead. And you might be occupying a small stretch of land, which is a very rare mineral resource. It might not be only gold, it might not only be diamonds, or it might even be uranium or minuscule microscopic traces of a material which is not available elsewhere. It could be manganese, it could be nickel, it could be whatever. There are certain countries which are fortunate in this sense, like Russia, like United States of America, which are not only large in size, which are not only large in population, which also have natural resources in abundance to look after their own, and also to control the energy security of other countries. Take Russia, for instance. In the Siberian Peninsula, they have rich resources of oil and gas, which are important for energy-hungry China, energy-hungry Japan. Even Indians invested billions of dollars in Sakhalin to have a partnership with the Russians when the prices were right for us. The same gas and oil pipeline goes through Russia and goes through Ukraine to Western Europe. And the Russian military interference in Ukraine was put up with by the Europeans because they knew that ultimately their happiness and their economic prosperity depends on the Russian gas and oil coming from Siberia. So there are certain countries which have these possibilities. There are certain other countries which are resource rich, but they don't control their own resources. Now, there are some interesting cases where this tug of war is continuing. Iran is rich in oil resources, second largest oil resources in the world after Saudi Arab, but they control their resources very tenuously. The Americans are imposing economic sanctions against them. Their economic development has been interfered with. Their nuclear development is being interfered with. Or take, for instance, the period of Cold War, when Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company and he was ousted, he was killed, some say with a conspiracy hatched by CIA. Reza Shah Pahlavi was installed as a king. He made money through oil exports and the Americans found him intolerable when he started buying American companies like Pan Am and investing massively. So he was ousted. Khomeini came. Khomeini turned out to be not an ally. Khomeini turned out to be a fanatical Islamic person, and he put the American diplomats in a siege. Americans under President Carter tried to break the siege, failed miserably, lost face, and since then America and Iran have been at loggerheads, so to speak. You have Venezuela, which was an oil exporting country, but when the Americans did not like the Venezuelans following the socialist path after Chavez, Chavez was very anti-American, his successor was very anti-American, so they tried to interfere in domestic politics of Venezuela by propping up the opponent to a duly elected president and supporting him and also assuring of military support. Unfortunately for Americans, fortunately for Venezuelans, this has not succeeded in change of regime in Venezuela. You take a case like Iraq, again oil-rich, demonization of Saddam Hussein, this whole canard about weapons of mass destruction, poison gas being used against his own citizens. Some of them allegations may be right, some of them allegations may be wrong, but after the regime change in Iraq and Libya, the net result is that the oil resources of Iraq and Libya are now controlled by American oil majors. So America doesn't need all this oil, but America controls this oil. America controls this oil and can deny it to another person who has an energy requirement. So this is important, that ownership of the natural resources doesn't necessarily mean that you have control of them, that you are sovereign power enough to deny its access to somebody else. And if this happens, unfortunately, your sovereignty is severely eroded. Now, this leads us to the third question, the third source of foreign policy or power, etc. So you have geographical expense, you have natural resources, and you have population. We have referred tangentially to population in terms of China is the largest country in the world in terms of population, India is the second largest. But do India and China compare as China is number one, India is number two? No, not really. Because China is a nuclear power recognized by the rest of the world. China is a member of the Security Council. China has $1 trillion economy and India is far behind. China is self-sufficient in rocketry, nuclear weaponry, military hardware. We are not comparing the nature of society, a democratic or otherwise, tyrannical or otherwise. What we are saying that in terms of sheer power politics, real politically, China is leagues ahead of India at the moment, although population-wise, India is number two, and some say in 2 decades, no, not wise, some say, is more or less generally agreed, India might be number one in terms of population. This leads us to an extremely intriguing situation. Is the number of people living in a country the most important thing? Or is it their age, their demographic profile in terms of health, education? China has an aging population. By the time India becomes the largest nation in terms of people in the world, we would still be a young population. China would be having a larger and larger number of retired population. Russian population, one of the larger populations in the first 10 in the world, is still an aging population, a disgruntled population. Maybe not disgruntled in the sense that they are not deprived of everything, but by now they think that they have made enough sacrifices for much too long a period. They want to have some creature comforts, some consumer facilities, they want to live life well. Chinese would have the burden of an aging population when India would still be having a young population. But is it necessarily an advantage? No, age is not the only factor. Is your population healthy? Is your population not suffering from malnutrition? Indian population has a large chunk which is under poverty line, where malnutrition is worse than sub-Saharan countries, where education, we say that we have the largest number of scientists, doctors, engineers, but what is the quality of our education? Our students don't get admission in centers of higher learning abroad unless they pass another couple of tests, English language proficiency tests, SAT tests, GRE tests, and then they find admissions difficult. Because India has a few extremely elitist institutions like IITs, IIMs, All India Institutes of Medical Sciences, etc. But none of the Indian universities figures in the list of the major 200 universities. IITs do, Institute of Science does, and 1 or 2 university makes an occasional appearance towards the end of the list in the 198th, 195th, and so on. Our primary school education is in a mess. Our secondary school education is in a mess. People are barely literate. People are barely healthy. And people are barely skilled enough to be self-employed. So the quality of education is poor. The quality of health of population is poor. This is not to criticize the Indian government in the past, which is only to face the facts that a large population does not necessarily make you a powerful nation unless you have a well-fed, healthy, well-educated population. Another factor is important. We talk of unity in diversity. In China, the 95% plus population is of Han origin. They belong to the same ethnic stock. In India, there are castes, there are tribes, there are different stocks. We celebrate our diversity, but at the cost of unity. There is linguistic diversity, there is regional parochialism, there is ethnic differences, there are religious differences, there are within religion, same religion, sectarian differences, there is a class division, and then we have a problem of these not being reconciled. Europeans, by and large, belong to one stock. They belong to one religion. They may be Roman Catholics, they may be Protestants, there may be sects within them, but by and large, they are inheritors to a shared European identity, including the Americans, the Anglo-Saxons. The Slavs in Russia are different. The Greek Orthodox Church is different. The Russian script is different, but that's a different issue altogether. So population is an important issue. The quality of population is interesting. Demographic profile is interesting. So we have discussed geographical size, shape, location, economic natural resources. We have discussed population. Another thing which is interesting is the cultural inheritance. And this is important because cultural inheritance is the national identity of a people. Do they have shared memories, or do they take pride in their historical heritage or built heritage like monuments, architecture, literature, or it is divisive? You say this mosque was built by an invader, it should be torn down. Or do you say that we are using a language which also is an exchange of words from the language of the invader and the language of the native dweller in this country? Are we talking of synthesis, or are we talking of clashes in past? I think an important thing which gets overlooked is that in the foreign policy of any country, big or small, the memories of victories and defeats, the shared racial memories of glorious past and decline are the ones which give rise to these urges of revenge or allow reconciliation. Take for instance the Chinese. Their self-image is that the Chinese emperor in past was a son of the heaven. Chinese were the only civilized people in the world. With good reason they can say so, thousands of year old civilization, responsible for many discoveries, many inventions, from rockets to paper to cultivation of silk to exchange of ideas, Confucianistic sort of ultimate merit-based mandarinate, the individual being put subordinate to the family, family subordinate to village, village subordinate to district, province, state, and ultimately the emperor. So you have an extremely hierarchical society organized without God, basic ethical principles, and the element of sacrifice, even in human self-sacrifice, built in civilizationally. So Mao becomes a kind of another son of heaven, another emperor, not ordained by divine rule but by his success of his revolution, but he has a structure of the Confucian civilization and the memory. He is leading Chinese people to glory again. And when he has a clash with the Americans, he proudly says, let there be a nuclear war. There will be more red than dead in China. So which means America is a paper tiger, and Americans reparteed that America may be a paper tiger, but it is the teeth of nuclear teeth, but it didn't amuse anybody else, because ultimately Nixon and Kissinger had to go to Peking and kowtow to Mao Zedong. So this element of how you identify yourself, even in 14th, 15th century, the eunuch Admiral Cheng Ho had extended the Chinese sphere all the way to Indonesia, and even till this date, the northern part of the Indian Ocean is called the South China Sea, and this is what China claims, that when it was weak, it never became a colony, but the European colonial powers, imperial powers, divided it amongst themselves, had enjoyed extraterritorial rights, tried to make the Chinese opium addicts, tried to steal away tea from them, and tried to subjugate them in any which way, tried to convert them, the Christian missionaries, the Boxer Rebellion, the hauteur of the British, and ultimately they had to make amends. They succeeded in getting Hong Kong handed back over to them in 1997. They promised one state, two systems. There's another story. You take Japanese. They have the same kind of a racial memory. They have a memory of victory and defeat. The Japanese are a derivative civilization of the Chinese civilization. Same kind of scripts, but they have no Confucian tradition. They have a samurai tradition. Like the Chinese emperor, the Japanese emperor considered himself a son of heaven. And they had a highly feudal system. The shogunate and the emperor maybe was the figurehead, but the samurai tradition, loss of face, harakiri, sekappu, is something which the Japanese have never gotten over. The General MacArthur made them surrender humiliatingly, and the Japanese emperor, numbed in shock by the atom bomb, to save the rest of his country from utter devastation, accepted surrender, terms of surrender, but the Japanese have not forgotten that. The Japanese have not forgotten the humiliation which the Americans heaped on them. The Japanese have not forgotten that they were emasculated. And the Japanese now want to assert and fight for their place in the world and regain their glory. The Japanese have not forgotten that at the height of their power, they were accepted in the Washington Naval Conference in the 1920s as an equal of the European powers. They were accepted as honorary whites by South Africans at one stage. The Japanese were a major power in the interregnum between the First World War and the Second World War. They were technologically called copycats, but then they excelled in optics, in computers, in technology, in automobiles. It so happened their economic success was achieved at a price. Their labor was expensive, their economic system was a mess, the banking system was a mess. There also was a nexus between politics and economics which didn't always work successfully. The feudal hierarchy worked very badly in corporate sector, but the Japanese remembered that there was a time when they attacked China and controlled large parts of China, and the Chinese were under their influence. Now, the whole point is that the Chinese and the Japanese have contending memories of the same historical past, and both of them occupy the same geographical space. Is the same in Indonesia, where Indonesians remember their glorious empires, Shailendra, Majapahit, Gajah, when Singapore was a fishing village of 150 people or more. Malaya was supposed to be Malaysia now, a land of pirates, and Indonesia was an imperial cosmopolitan country with a massive civilization, maybe influenced by India, but regional power on its own. The Vietnamese have the same memories. They were the smaller dragon under the sway of the Chinese, but they have memories of the Tuang Chin sisters who rose in revolt against the Chinese oppressors. So you have this. The Vietnamese may, at the moment after reunification, be part of the American world system, but they couldn't have forgotten the devastating genocidal war which the Americans fought on their soil, including genocide, ecocide, Nepal bombing, and so on. Americans ultimately had to withdraw. So you have these memories, and you cannot wish away these memories. You can't airbrush these memories. Take, for instance, India. We still have like an old itch of eczema. We go back to 1962, and the Chinese say India should not forget, if there is a Doklam confrontation eyeball to eyeball, that what we did to them in 62, we can do that again. And India can say China should not forget, India of today is not India of 1962. So these memories are historical memories of defeats, victories, vengeance, humiliation. More important than anything else, they are identities. The Islamic identity basically goes back to the glories of Islamic empire, when the empire ran from the borders of Kublai Khan till Spain, Granada, where the great mosque of Cordoba was built, and the Moors were talked about in Shakespearean plays, and Byzantium was the center of universe, and Turkey may have been treated as the sick man of Europe, but they had glories of Byzantium in mind. They had memories of crusades which were won by the Christians, maybe by deceit, maybe by chance, but they remembered Islam as a glorious civilization which they are inherited to. There may have been fights between Shias and Sunnis, between Iranis and the Arabs, the Persians and the Arabs, but they do have memories of a past, and they have control of economic resources, and they don't like the period of European domination where they were reduced to ciphers. So you have Islamic civilization, you have the Chinese Confucian civilization, you have the Japanese samurai tradition, you have other similar memories in past, and take the Americans. The Americans have a self-image that they are here to fulfill the America's manifest destiny. They were the original Republican Revolution 20 years before the French Revolution, and they have remained uninterrupted, no monarchical, no imperial intervention in between. God has been kind to them. They inherited the promised land, rich in natural resources. Nobody talks about their genocide of the Red Indians on the North American or the Central American subcontinent, nor or on the Canadian part of the North America. People have forgotten that the original inhabitants were made extinct, and their land was taken over by those who came, the pilgrims on Mayflower. Now it is America is their land. It's God's gift to them. And they are fulfilling the manifest destiny, like the civilization, white man's civilizational burden of the colonial period. They are casting the rest of the world in their own image, including Europe. So what is good for America is good for the world. And the American model of democracy, the American model of economic organization, the American legal system, the American media, the American concept of civil rights is what is there. Unless you are at the receiving end, unless you are a Cuban, a Mexican, Hispanic, a Filipino, then you realize that, back again to Orwell, some animals are more equal than some other animals. The great animal farm double speak. So I think you have this tendency to imagine, recreate your past, and every time you revert your memories, you add something to it. You elaborate them, you ornament them, and you have races which you have won, you have lost, you want to win back again. Take, for instance, the race in the space. The Russians sent the Sputnik first, the dog Laika first, Yuri Gagarin, the man first. Americans could not rest in peace till they landed Neil Armstrong on the moon earlier than the Russians could do that. Russians chose not to do that. They sent a spaceship Soyuz and had this. Then the collaboration started. So all these racial memories are important. In India, when we say that in 21st century we are a rising power in Asia, we hark back to days when we were a great power before the Turko-Afghan Sultanate subdued Indian rulers, before the Mughals were a mighty empire, before the Europeans had laid their feet on this land. So we go back to a golden past which may or may not have existed, but it's a reality in the formulation of foreign policy, in conduct of diplomacy, losing face or otherwise. What is important is that the diplomacy of the nation may keep playing with past, but should never forget that the world also has different images of their own. So you have to have a diplomacy which is resilient, which is flexible, which copes with the changing realities of the world outside. This brings us to the fifth and perhaps the most important part of the instruments or sources of foreign policy, not instrument but domestic sources of foreign policy. It is the quality of the political leadership. Now the political leadership, we start with the assumption, has to be democratic. But why only the Westminster model? Why only the American model of democracy? Why not Majlis Musawwara, which the tribal Arabs follow? Why not the Chinese Confucianist system? But as long as the political leadership is capable, is honest, not corrupt, is far-sighted and visionary, is looking at future but has not forgotten the past, and can adapt its diplomacy flexible and look for to the benefit of the largest number in the country, you would say that the national interest is being served properly. After we review the domestic sources of foreign policy, we might as well have a close look at the instruments of foreign policy. For most people, foreign policy is directly related to defense policies, and the instrument of foreign policy which is most effective is military power. Any country which is militarily powerful can impose its will on a weaker country. It can, of course, protect its own interests, its own boundaries, its own interests with its military power. Now, the interesting thing is military power obtained in vacuum, or do you need a strong economic base with resources, at least energy and food, of your own to follow a line of military power? If you see the case, the decline of Soviet Union and disintegration, we normally say was perestroika and glasnost introduced by Mikhail Gorbachev. But the real causes were different. Ronald Reagan imposed on Russia an arms race, which was called the Star Wars, which put an unbearable burden on the Russians, because the Russian society and the economy was geared to armament production, and it could not produce enough consumer goods. So at one level, the economy was causing resentment among the masses because they were not, after 50 years of revolution, still long lines to get stuff which they needed on an everyday basis. And at the same time, all the resources of the nation being spent on a race to keep up with the Joneses in America. So the American economy was stronger. American economy, thanks to operation of multinational corporations, which are a misnomer, is an oxymoron. They probably are owned by one country. Most of them are managed and owned by Americans. They had something which Eisenhower called a military-industrial complex. Ever since the Second World War, of course, Eisenhower said it critically that the American politics was being dominated by military-industrial complex, but the military-industrial complex ensured that the American private business got richer and richer manufacturing arms for Americans and the rest of the world. It helped America if the wars were being fought despite the Cold War balance of terror elsewhere in other parts of the world, and the American economy was flourishing. It was flourishing enough to have enough products for consumers to keep them happy, from colored television to fast food to jeans to clothes to holidays and vacations and good affordable education and so on. Russians couldn't match that. So there is this question of military power is necessarily an instrument of foreign policy, but it's not independent. You must have a well-oiled economic system which can take the load of military expenditure. X amount of your budget can go to military, but the rest of it has to go to welfare activities, so that you don't have social unrest. Interestingly, the third thing is again the political system. If you have a political system which is democratic, more or less, democratic in the sense that it is responsive to what the people are wanting and is responsible, besides being responsive, to deliver it, you probably manage your economy a little better. So ultimately, the disintegration and dissolution of Soviet Union was the failure of the economic model which was proposed by the communists. It failed on all fronts. And as sympathetic a scholar as Eric Hobsbawm, the historian, said, communism is dead. Communism is dead because communism failed as a system of economic organization and distribution. China opted for the path of fourth great modernization because Deng Xiaoping realized that the Maoist emphasis on, ever since the Great Cultural Revolution, on doctrinaire dimension of development in economic organization was a total failure. It had set China back very many years. So they opted by another name for a capitalist model of development. They had special economic zones. They had one state, two systems in Hong Kong. But the problem was that the Chinese would isolate the rest of the country from this contagion of capitalism, but followed this policy. India, when it opted for the path of economic liberalization, did concede the point that trying to capture the commanding heights of economy like the Soviet system was wrong. The mixed economic system was not delivering goods. It had public sector was laggard, it was getting corrupt, and the license permit Raj, what they called, was making Indian economy sluggish. Now there is a general agreement. Let's not get into this vacuous debate that was Nehru short-sighted, what did he make India backward? No, he did not. Because when India became independent, it was needed to have that system where India did not have the resources to have a mixed economy, to have the commanding heights of economy, and let state take lead in areas where no private capital bourgeoisie was going to put his investment there. There was a problem of technology, there was a problem of capital, there's a problem of semi-literate population, there was a problem of national unification, integration of princely states, rehabilitation of post-partition refugees, the war with China, the drop in the 5-year plans, and so on. But the fact remains that India too in 1990s had to concede that the economic system which had governed its foreign policy, the socialist model, was not right, and we opted for economic liberalization. Once you do that, what Raja Mohan says, you cross the Rubicon. You follow the American model, and you again, the American European capitalist model has certain very interesting compulsions. Then you accept the market supply and demand dictates. Then you have to be not entirely independent and self-reliant and be mutually dependent for various many things. The hazard there is that once you do that, once you make this political choice, then you are dependent on an economic power which is disproportionately larger than you, which is asymmetric. So if you once concede, then you can't go back to the other model at all. So now you say that, look, what we are doing is that we want people to get out of farming and get into more productive activities. But once you do that, what happens to your food security? Does it mean that the people who get out of the agricultural sector can be readily employed in any other sector? Over a period of time, you again are confronted with the problem of facing the erosion of sovereignty and compromising your political independence because you have become economically dependent, especially in terms of food security, energy security, and technological prowess on others. Now, this again is going back to the same question. Who takes these decisions? Is the ruling elite? Is the ruling elite responsible and responsive to the masses? Is there a political system which is efficient, not corrupt? Is there an informed debate in a polity, in a nation state about these things? Is foreign policy a luxurious preserve of a small ruling elite? Or people realize that it concerns their everyday life. Forget about India for a moment. Look at what is happening in Britain at the moment. One prime minister ordered a referendum on opting out of European Union, and Brexit by a very narrow margin was decided. Britain is one of the oldest parliamentary democracies in the world, although a constitutional monarchy, but a parliamentary democracy. And the parliament is totally paralyzed at the moment. One person, Boris Johnson, has started behaving in a manner which is worse than the dictatorial Trump or the leader of the North Korea, who's supposed to be totally eccentric. And he is bullheaded about this and is tearing apart the nation. So this decision made by one prime minister hastily without foresight and farsight has become a burden, an albatross around the neck of Britain. And this country, affluent, educated, democratic, is finding itself in a horrible bind. So this is what happens even a temporary weakness lapse of a government in an old ancient democracy, which has informed public opinion, renders its foreign policy absolutely a total failure. Additional matter for Indian foreign policy, the Gujral Doctrine. There was a short interlude in the Indian foreign policy domain when Mr. Gujral was the Prime Minister. He was a surprised candidate. He didn't have a mass following. But when he became the Prime Minister, he enunciated something which is called the Gujral Doctrine. And this Gujral Doctrine was giving primacy to the interest of smaller neighbors of India, making concessions and compromises to keep them happy. This was partly a legacy of the past of Mr. Gujral, who was a Punjabi refugee, who remembered very happily, cherished the memories of youth spent in Lahore, his days with the communist movement as a young man, and his proximity to the Nehru-Gandhi family when he was in politics in the beginning. Later on, he was anti-Congress, but there was at one time when he was there. He forgot in his nostalgia of pre-partition India that the smaller neighbors would misunderstand his gestures. They would not reciprocate it. They would think it that India was weak and was making a compromise and was surrendering its primary national interests. And this is exactly what happened. The Aman ki Asha, the hope for peace dissipated very fast. Neither in Nepal nor in Pakistan could the Gujral Doctrine make much headway. Additional matter for determinants of foreign policy, the softer power dimension, education and quality of population. It is not enough to have a large population. It is the quality of population and the democratic profile which matters most. Is the population healthy? It is well educated? Is it homogeneous? And does it have enough skills to progress economically and technologically? Often enough in this country, we make a boast that India has the largest number of engineers, the second largest manpower of trained scientists in the world, but we are indifferent about the quality. We forget that there are a handful of elite institutions like Indian Institutes of Management, IIMs, IITs, Indian Institutes of Technology, All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Indian Institute of Science, which figure in the list of top academic research institutions in the world. Hardly ever does an Indian university make it to the first 200 spots. Maybe they appear momentarily at 195, 97 once to drop away into oblivion the other way around. When Indians apply for admissions to foreign universities, they have to go through the grind again. They have to pass GRE, GMAT, SAT, English language qualifications, and even then find it very difficult to enter a really competitive thing. So I think we have to worry about our primary school education, secondary school education, and equity in education, where various universities maintain global standards.